Earlier this month, Vatican police arrested Italian businessman Gianluigi Torzi, who was involved in the controversial London real estate deal on suspicion of extortion, fraud, and money laundering. The scandal broke last October when Vatican police raided the Secretariat of State and the Vatican's financial watchdog agency. Half a dozen Vatican officials were suspended. Last week, the Financial Times reported they have seen contracts, banking records, and the accounts of people with direct knowledge of the Vatican's financial affairs. They suggest that the deal with Mr. Torzi was approved by some of the major senior officials at the Vatican, including Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin. This revelation casts doubts on the Vatican's official narrative that the controversy surrounding this London property was the work of Torzi and a handful of junior administrators who were all suspended during the investigation. For more on all of this and to talk about his new book, we're joined by papal biographer, author of The Next Pope, The Office of Peter, and the Church in Mission. Please welcome George Weigel back to the program. George, I want to begin with this news reported by the Financial Times. 3 weeks before Italian investor Gianluigi Torzi, his company took control of that Chelsea property in question, Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, authorized his deputy, Venezuelan Archbishop Edgar Peña-Parra, to take control of the Secretariat's bank accounts. Then on November 28th, Peña-Parra sent a request for payment to be made, and that resulted in that building in London, to be transferred to Torzi's Luxembourg shell company. Where does this leave us, George Weigel? Originally, the Vatican said Torzi acted alone.
I think it underscores, Raymond, a point that I make in this book, The Next Pope, and that is that you can shift boxes around on an organization chart forever. But what really counts in reforming the finances of the Holy See is the character of the people involved with those finances. And the next Pope, as his predecessors have tried to do, has got to put in place people who are committed to financial probity, to transparency in the Vatican's financial transactions, and who know something about money. There's no reason to think that a papal diplomat has particular skills in finance. I've seen a flow chart of this Chelsea deal. It's more complicated than the flow chart that was going around a few months ago, trying to demonstrate how a guy making bat soup in China ended up creating a toilet paper shortage in San Diego. I mean, it's an unbelievably complicated mess. But beneath that mess is a lesson that I underscore in the section of this book on Vatican reform, and that is character. Character is the crucial variable in Vatican administrative and financial reform.
Well, relative to that, the other figure embroiled in all of this is the previous substituto, Giovanni Angelo Becciu, now Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. What comes of the trial here, George? And where does this place Cardinal Pell's warning, the previous head of that economic secretariat? You know, he tried to implement all sorts of reforms. Where do we situate him in all of this now, in light of what's come to pass?
Yeah, I was speaking to Cardinal Pell just about a week ago. He believes, and I believe, there's a lot more that remains to come out on the Torzi story, or through the Torzi arrest and his eventual trial. But it seems to me, and I immediately say I am no expert in international finance, but it does seem to me that Cardinal Pell has been thoroughly vindicated in his reformist efforts. He attempted to get a lot done quickly. A lot of people criticized him for that, and some people were obviously made uncomfortable by it. But when we now see just how tangled this web is, and more to the point, how it undercuts, damages the evangelical mission of the Church, then the more it seems clear to me that Pope Francis did the right thing in bringing in a knowledgeable guy with a lot of courage, like Cardinal Pell, to try to sort this out. And that is going to happen going forward in the future.
Pope Francis just appointed the first layman ever to run the administration of the patrimony of the Holy See, a former Ernst & Young executive. He will be managing all of those assets. Will he be allowed to do the job he was appointed to do, George? That's the real question here. I mean, Cardinal Pell tried to move many of these initiatives, and then they were pulled back. Now we're re-implementing them again, it seems.
I have no idea whether this man is going to be allowed to do what he's supposed to do. His reputation is a fine one. But I think we have to get to grips now and in the future with the fact that there are systemic problems in Vatican finance, that there are attitudes towards money that need to be rooted out of the Holy See, and that there has to be a consolidation of Vatican assets so we know what we're talking about here. I mean, the notion that there's 300 million euros here and 250 million euros there, and who knows what all, this was part of what Cardinal Pell was trying to sort out. But you're dealing with deeply entrenched bureaucratic interests, and that, to come back to where I started, is why character is the crucial variable in all of this. And it has to be addressed because the church has to be seen to be living what it proclaims.
Yeah. Well, speaking of character, George, a June 13th report by Crux, later confirmed by CNA, Argentinian Bishop Gustavo Zanchetta, no unfamiliar name on this show, a close friend of Pope Francis, has returned to work at the Vatican Central Bank. He is still under investigation, George, for sexual improprieties with seminarians back in Argentina. How is it possible, given Zanchetta's well-known history, that he's back on the job while still under investigation?
Seems strange to me, Raymond. I haven't followed the Zanchetta case closely. It does seem to me to send a very bad signal in a church that is desperately trying to get its arms around the problem of clerical sexual abuse, to address this. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's essential to the proclamation of the gospel. The church has to be seen to live what the church proclaims if that proclamation is going to have any credibility. That's what's at stake in all of this, whether it's sexual propriety or financial propriety.
And this is at the heart of your message in your new book, The Next Pope. And it really is, the subtitle is The Office of Peter and the Church in Mission. Now, you say in that book, George, the Catholic Church will be crossing into uncharted territory in the next pontificate. What do you mean by that? And why did you feel it necessary to write a book like this now, really an action plan for the next pontificate?
I mean two things by it, Raymond. As you and I have discussed on your program many times, we're in the midst of the fifth great epical transition in Catholic history. This time, the transition from the Church of the Counter-Reformation to the Church of the New Evangelization. We've been in that transition for more than 100 years now, and it's one of the reasons why there's so much turbulence in the church. But within that transition, there's another transition coming up. The next pope will not have been a man who experienced the Second Vatican Council, which accelerated this turn into the new evangelization in the way that John Paul II, Benedict XVI, or Pope Francis experienced. The next pope might have been a teenager at the time of Vatican II, could even have been a child at the time of Vatican II. So it seemed to me that it might be helpful to the whole church, as well as, I hope, to those responsible for choosing the successor of Peter, to ask in this small book, what have we learned over the past 50 years? What seems to be fruitful for the proclamation of the gospel? Where is the church living and why? And where is the church dying and why? And that's what I've tried to lay out in a very straightforward, I hope non-polemical way. And I hope that that does indeed provide a template for thinking about the entire Catholic future, but also about the future of the office of Peter.
In your book, you say the next pope must be fully committed to the new evangelization as the Church's grand strategy in this 21st century. You write this: the Catholic Church does not exist by itself or for itself. The Catholic Church exists because of the salvific design of God, which is the interior truth of history and the cosmos. And the Catholic Church exists to proclaim Jesus Christ and his gospel. Now, based on history and the current state of the Church today, do you think a new evangelization will be the greatest challenge the next pope will have to deal with?
Well, it's the challenge that every pope deals with, and that's been true since St. Peter gave the first Catholic sermon on the first Christian Pentecost. It's what's striking to me now, Raymond, is that if you look around the world church, which is a very complicated place, talking about 1.3 billion people in every imaginable cultural circumstance, and yet amidst that complexity, some things are quite clear, or at least seem to me quite clear, and I try to explain them in this book. The first thing that's clear is that the church that has embraced the gospel, that proclaims the gospel boldly, with compassion, which offers others the possibility of friendship with Jesus Christ, which says with confidence, Jesus Christ is the answer to the question that is every human life, that church is living, and it's vibrant, and it's of service to society. Where the church has lost confidence in the gospel, where the church has simply become another non-governmental organization, doing good works in society, that church is dying. That's the fundamental divide in Catholicism today. And those who would lead the church, whether that's local churches or the universal church, seem to me have got to wrestle with that fundamental truth of the contemporary Catholic situation, which means, of course, that the path forward is the path that John Paul II called the new evangelization.
George, when I read the line, there was a line in the book where you say, and I'm paraphrasing, the Catholic future rooted in the Great Commission has stalled. And I thought to myself, is that because the laity as well as the clerics have lost passion? It doesn't mean enough to them to even fight for it, much less to proclaim it or defend it? What do you mean that it's stalled, the Great Commission?
If you're thinking about the section that I'm thinking about, there are moments throughout the history where the church's vitality lags, where the business of proclaiming the gospel, bringing others into the fellowship of the Lord, seems to stall, seems to hit a rut, seems not to be going anywhere. That's, in a sense, to be expected. This is a church of sinners. Everybody in the Catholic Church is imperfectly converted. So there are going to be periods where we stall. The question is what we do when we're in that stall.
Right.
And I think in that same passage of the book, I make mention of something that's struck me with great force in recent years. There are libraries full of books of church history, but there's only one divinely inspired history of the church. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. It's the 5th book in the New Testament. How does the Acts of the Apostles end? It ends with a shipwreck. But the shipwreck becomes the occasion for St. Paul to cooperate with God's providence in bringing the gospel to new places. So that's what we have to understand in these moments when things seem to be sputtering a bit or the engine seems to be stalled. There is a divine purpose still at work in the church. And if we cooperate with the grace of God, which we're promised will always be with us, then we can get out of the rut, we can fix the stall, we can get the engine running again. and we can get about the business of the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations.
All nations.
But we've got to
Yeah.
understand that that Great Commission is addressed to all of us. Every Catholic on the day of his or her baptism was given the Great Commission. If we all understood that, we would be truly the Church of the New Evangelization.
Mm-hmm. In the book you write, the Church of the 21st century will be a Christ-centered church, born of the gospel in full, or it will not be. Those who would lead the church must understand that. Why do you think they don't understand that today, George?
Well, it's a real puzzle to me, Raymond. Look at Germany, for example. What's going on in Germany today is sometimes called a slow motion schism. I might even have used that term myself in a column or two.
Mm-hmm.
I now come to think that what's going on there is actually something far graver. What's going on there is close to apostasy. Leaders of the church, people of the church, have simply ceased to believe that the gospel is true. And yet they have this huge institution funded by the state through the so-called church tax. So what do you do with it? Well, you turn the church into an NGO in the good works business, some of which are indeed good works. But that's not living the Great Commission. Wherever the church is dying, it's because of a lack of faith. And the Lord knew this 2,000 years ago. When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on earth? At the moment, he's having a hard time finding it in Dusseldorf and Munich and Berlin and a few other places. And that's a great sadness, because there's a wonderful tradition of Catholic life in the German-speaking world. German-speaking Catholicism is very generous in its support of the church in the Third World. But there's a fundamental problem of faith, and when the faith is weak, the mission simply stops, and the church stops.
George, in our remaining minutes, you write about papal protagonism in this book. What does that mean, and why do you hope we're going to see a bit more of it in the future? And I'm going to add this question to it. I know, because you don't give a list of men you hope or will be the next pope, or men you think should be the next pope. What should that pope look like if you had to describe him?
The next pope, like his predecessors, will be successful to the degree that he manifests in his own life. The joy of the gospel, the conviction that Jesus Christ is the answer to the question that is every human life, and that fellowship with the Lord is the royal road to human flourishing. That's what we're looking for, not only in the Pope, but in the ordained leadership of the church, and indeed in the people of the church. Actually, what I said is I think we need a little less papal protagonism, in the sense that Catholicism has become awfully pope-ocentric over the last 150, 200 years. That's not the entirety of the Catholic Church by any manner of means. And when you are focused so narrow on what the Pope is doing, what the Pope is saying, you may miss all of the other things that are going on in the church that really could be enlivening and we don't, for example, spend anywhere near enough time examining the vitality of the Catholic Church in sub-Saharan Africa today. This is an extraordinary story. But because we're so Rome-centered, as in the United States, we're so presidency-centered, we miss all of the vitality that's going on elsewhere. I do think the next Pope, as his predecessors have tried to do, but the next one has to do it, try perhaps a bit harder, has to deliberately work to empower local Catholic leadership. The church is a very large and complicated business, and it cannot be run in this evangelical sense simply by one man. We need bishops, priests, religious, lay leaders empowered by the successor of Peter to get about the business of the new evangelization. That's
George,
the future.
you also, you also urge the next pope to be willing to remove errant bishops. Why? Why did you put that there? Why do you think that's been missing?
Because it's necessary. This is not always a case of wickedness, although sometimes it is, unfortunately. It's sometimes a case of simply a misfit or a man who has lost the capacity to govern for a variety of reasons. You know, Raymond, the church has spent the last 200 years gaining control for itself over the appointment of bishops. Pius the Ninth, for example, in the mid-19th century, had a very limited free appointment of bishops around the world. He was tied up by states appointing bishops, by cathedral chapters appointing bishops, and so forth and so on. We now have reclaimed the right of the church to order its own life by the Pope naming bishops. Well, if you're going to claim that right, then you have to claim the responsibility. You have to own the responsibility of removing the mistakes that are made. This is crucial for the Catholic future. You cannot have a Catholic Church without bishops. You cannot have an evangelically vibrant local diocese without a bishop who has the credibility to be the leader of that diocese. So when that credibility is lost, for whatever reason, measures have to be taken to fix the problem.
George, I mean, a final question. In the book, The Next Pope, you write and you warn several times, I found it several times throughout the book, quote, "The gospel cannot be set against doctrine or mercy against truth." Is that what, in your estimation, we've been witnessing in the last few years?
It's something that we've been witnessing in various parts of the church for a long time. There's a tendency in many parts of the church to think that you can somehow separate truth from mercy or gospel from doctrine. This always leads to trouble. The most merciful thing we can often do for people is help them understand the truth of their situation.
Right,
by the same token, that truth has to be spoken with compassion, with understanding. And the face of the merciful Father has to be displayed before the world. It's not an either-or business. What we want, what we need, what the Lord wants is both and Catholicism, or as I've called it sometimes, all-in Catholicism. Not the pick and choose business where you try one flavor and then try another flavor.
Right. George Weigel, I thank you for your time, your insight. The book is The Next Pope, The Office of Peter and a Church in Mission. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online. George, thanks again.
Thank you, Raymond.